returning to the program is Professor Debbie Felton. Dr. Felton is Professor of Classics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She is the editor of the journal Preternature and has edited and authored several scholarly articles and books about monsters and the supernatural in antiquity. Dr. Felton's books include Monsters and Monarchs, Serial Killers in Classical Myth and History, as well as the edited volumes, The Oxford Handbook of Monsters and Classical Myth, and the volume which we'll be drawing much of our discussion from today, A Cultural History of Fairy Tales in Antiquity. I hope that comes out on the screen. I apologize if it doesn't. So, Debbie, welcome back to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. It's so nice to have a chat again. And I thoroughly enjoyed our last discussion, and I loved the preparation leading up to this talk. So I'm very excited. Um, so fairy tales is at first glance, it would seem that fairy tales are a rather new development in narrative, and an intersection with classics should be dismissed or approached with caution. But you and other scholars who specialize in folklore and classics such as Graham Anderson and William Hansen, argue that there are indeed analogs to modern iterations of these tales, found not only in the pan-Mediterranean world, but also in China and India, among other places. So, can you tell us about this a bit further? Also, what are some of the standard reference works scholars use in this cross-disciplinary approach?
Oh, sure. Um, well, I think I should probably start with a disclaimer that I personally don't have any formal academic training in folkloristics, the study of comparative folklore, that sort of thing. But Bill Hansen was, my unofficial mentor. I was introduced to him when I was a grad student at a different university, and he just was so generous with his time and information in telling me about these resources that you're asking about. And so, basically, Bill Hansen was one of the first people to really combine the study of classics and folklore. That is, to look at folklore within classical literature. And Graham Anderson has also done a huge amount of work in that area. Then there have been a few others like Alex Scobie, and but it's not, the thing is, that folklore, when people like Bill, started, and myself for that matter, when we started looking at folk tales in classical literature, we ran up against some skepticism. I can't, speak so much for Bill as for myself, but when I tried to say to, like submit a paper on the topic to a journal, I would get back comments like, "Folklore isn't serious scholarship. You've got to be joking." Basically. So yes, this I bring this up because this has to do with pretty much the first thing you said, which is that at first you wouldn't think that these tales are present 2 and 3,000 years ago or more. They absolutely are, and, thanks to the study of comparative folkloristics, we can point to evidence for this. So, a couple of the main resources that you're asking me about, there are 2, I would say 2 principal reference works that sort of help scholars, with identifying, whether you're dealing with a folktale of some sort, or at least with some folktale motifs. So there is, for example, there is the tale type index. There's a reference work called the tale type index, and that is basically a study of like the narrative structure of tale types. And so what it does is it collects tales that have a similar theme, similar narrative structure. And the other main work would be the index of motifs, folktale motifs, and those are the smaller units within a folktale. So, for example, if Cinderella is a folktale type, a specific motif in there would be the shoe, like she loses a shoe and is later identified by it. So there's the whole plot where she sort of starts in a low position and ends up royalty, so that's the plot, and then the details are motifs.
And of course, you mentioned William Hansen, who is, I would argue, the foremost expert on this topic.
Yeah.
In his reference work as well is something that I can't recommend enough, which is Ariadne's Thread. This is a wonderful work. It's a guide to international tales found in classical literature, and Bill just kind of breaks it down. Like he has them in alphabetical order, and then he just kinda goes through the tale types, and then he, explains, like, "Oh, these are the motifs that you find in, say, India or China or 18th century
Mhm.
England," or something like that, and then he, applies it to the Mediterranean analog, so, highly
Yeah.
recommend that one for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and I should have mentioned, I think I was thinking of the basic, reference work. I mean, that is for classics and folktale especially. The 2 that I mentioned, the tale type index and the motif index are just the ones that comparative folkloristics use as, like, I don't wanna say they're Bibles, but, basically they're that's where you sort of start with that. And, in terms of, say, Graham Anderson, for example, he, has done several books specifically on fairy tales in the ancient world. Yes, thank you for letting that one know. And so excuse me. Um so basically, people like Bill Hansen and Graham Anderson are trying to make some distinctions between folk tales generally and fairy tales, which are a type of folk tale, but maybe present slightly differently in terms of what is
Absolutely.
more of a fairy tale.
Absolutely. So in your the volume that you edited, which Graham Anderson did contribute to as well, Cultural History of Fairy Tales and Antiquity.
Yeah.
But in that volume, A Cultural History of Fairy Tales, um, y- there are several characteristics and approaches to fairy tales that each of the essays focuses on. So I'd like to get to some of these characteristics of
Sure.
these types of tales, and of course, I'd like to tackle them from the aspects of the wondrous, space, and power. And we'll get into this
Yeah.
further in the tales themselves, but could you kind of discuss these characteristics briefly?
Oh, sure. Well, for example, Graham Anderson's chapter, which basically opens that volume, covers the marvelous and the wondrous. And so he focuses on that as a main aspect of fairy tales in particular. Folk tales can have, obviously marvels and wonders. I mean, if you think of a story like the brave little tailor, right, who somehow manages to if people end up thinking that he's somehow killed ogres because he's killed 7 flies, with a blow of his belt, and he just says 7 with 1 blow. So that would be a folk tale. There aren't really any magical elements in it, but the wonder aspect and the marvels is something you see more of in fairy tales as opposed to folk tales. I mean, I was gonna say, so if you take something like Little Red Riding Hood, for example, for which there does seem to be a medieval analog, we think of that as a Grimm's fairy tale, but really the only, magical element is a talking wolf. Uh, so in fairy tales, I mean, they don't necessarily have to have fairies literally in them, but there's usually more magic going on or something more supernatural. So, so Graham Anderson's chapter, for example, talks about wondrous voyages, for example, and magical elements. And then you asked about space and power. So the chapter on space discusses. I mean, one of your things that you opened with was liminal. The idea of liminality in general, which originally was an anthropological concept having to do with rites of passage in people's lives, but has been used in literature to describe spaces and times that are sort of betwixt and between others. So, for example, when you think of a lot of ghosts and ghost stories appear on stairways, well, that's because they're not on one floor or another. They're kind of in between. So the staircase is considered a sort of liminal place. And so the chapter on space talks about liminal spaces and times. A lot of supernatural events occur at noon in ancient literature and also midnight, but noon is there's no shadows at noon and it's between morning and afternoon, so it's like a kind of a time when the veil can be pierced, and dusk and dawn too. And then power is something else that shows up in a lot of fairy tales in terms of power structures and dynamics and trying to overcome them. Like Cinderella, again, might be a sort of an example of that. There are obviously a lot of others, but being able to rise from a poor position, overcome obstacles, and end up with a higher social status is sort of an increase in I don't know if power is quite the right word for that in particular, but the questioning of the social order on the social dynamics is part of the power struggle. So I don't know if that's,
Absolutely.
sort of what you were looking for there.
Yeah, definitely right on the money. I think that it's important to point out, especially with the conceptualizations of power, that these tales are used also to prop up certain social systems, much like
Mhm.
myth, right? In
Yeah.
the ancient Mediterranean world. So they present archetypes by which how people understand their social order and how power is negotiated. And we won't talk about the Aesopic fables as much, but there's a lot of that going on
Mhm.
in there as well. Um, so I wanted the audience to just keep those three conceptions in mind. Of course, the wondrous is extremely important. Space and how space is negotiated, and um, the creations of distance, and like these liminal spaces, like Debbie was talking about, is important. And power is extremely important in these um, tales. So as we go through these stories, we're going to analyze them whenever possible through these lenses: the wondrous, liminal space, and power. Um, so let's kind of get into the antique fairy and folk tales proper. Um, let's focus on perhaps one of the earliest in our samplings, and also a throwback to our first discussion on the monstrous, actually, since it
Mm.
involves a dracon, a giant snake.
Yeah.
This
Excuse
is the
me.
story from Egypt during the Middle Kingdom, roughly circa 20th to 18th centuries BCE. Um, the shipwrecked sailor, which is honestly a
Yeah.
story that I was not familiar with until I started preparing for this discussion. So, Debbie, tell us about the shipwrecked sailor.
Okay, yeah, so I think it's usually referred to as the tale of the shipwrecked sailor. It's actually quite short. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the earlier stories are relatively short, and in part because sometimes, the papyrus or the manuscript was damaged, so we're missing a beginning or an ending. The tale of the shipwrecked sailor, we do seem to have the whole thing, and, as you said, the shipwrecked sailor comes from ancient Egypt. It dates to the Middle Kingdom, which is around the, 3rd to 2nd millennia, BCE, and it was found in a papyrus scroll, that's which is pretty much where the Egyptian stories are all found, and um it's told as a sort of a flashback narrative by the shipwrecked sailor. He's the only one of his crew who survives. It's a merchant ship. It's sailing around. It's supposed to be getting some goods for the king and bringing pharaoh, I guess is really the word we should use here. Um, so it's traveling to get some merchandise, but it hits a storm, is shipwrecked, and this one sailor survives and he washes up on an island. It turns out to be a magical island. He doesn't know this right away, in the beginning, his initial shipwreck, he's despairing. He just sort of lies there for a couple of days, lamenting his fate, feeling guilty for surviving, thinking this is it, he's going to die. But along comes this gigantic magical serpent that is probably a deity of some sort. It might even, be some sort of an avatar of the sun god Ra. I'm not sure people have decided on that or not. But it's this terrifying sight, and the sailor is convinced he's gonna be eaten. Instead, this giant, this Draco, this sort of dragon speaks to him and says, "Don't worry, as long as you tell me the truth and when you answer my questions, I will treat you well." And so the sailor does just that. When the serpent asks, "Who are you? Why are you here? What are your intentions?" The sailor explains, "I was shipwrecked, I just wanna go home." Um And the serpent tells the man his own story, like how the serpent ended up there. This serpent is basically the prince of this island, which is called Punt, and he tells the sailor that he's the sole survivor of a similar disaster, and he basically befriends the sailor. And the sailor is very grateful for the serpent helping him survive, and he says, "When I get home, I'll tell everybody about you." And the serpent says, "Oh no, you won't. Okay, you won't. If you try to come back, you won't find me or this island. We're just gonna disappear," which is essentially what happens for reasons we can speculate about, such as that, they didn't want this magical place overrun with people trying to, just ruin its resources and all that, among other things. But the basic, moral of the story is, behave with honesty and gratitude, and consider the importance of family, because the sailor wanted to get home to his family, and the magical serpent was also talking about his family and how they all survived. So it's this friendship between a shipwrecked sailor and this magical serpent. The sailor does get back home, and the question is anyone going to believe his story?
And I
Yeah,
found that very fascinating as well in terms of, again, you have the issues of space as well, right?
yeah.
It almost made me kind of think about, wonder if there's like a certain kind of ethnographic concern there as well that you find in, I don't know, perhaps that's kind of reaching, but just this concept of like a distant uh, kind of group of people or snakes in this case who, who lives in this mystical land
Hmm.
far away, kind of reminds me of these topsy-turvy aspects that you would find later in writers like Herodotus.
Hmm.
I don't know, but that's just my own
Yeah.
speculation about it. Very
No,
interesting.
I think that's really good because there is this sort of a theme that the farther away you get from your home in antiquity, the far well maybe nowadays too, the farther you get from your home, the stranger things are. Like they don't, you always have like this sort of centric view of yourself and your culture, and then everybody else's are strange. And really, there is this sort of sense in the story that one of the reasons the island is going to disappear is because they don't, they don't want to be colonized. They don't want to be, plundered for their resources and the sorts of things that men tend to do. People tend to do. And yes, in Herodotus later on, there's quite a lot of that, and in Ctesias and other authors who talk about the places on the farthest known fringes, again, a space issue. When you're on the edges of the known world, things are strange. There are dog-headed people, the kunokephali. There are people with no heads but eyes in their chests, later called the blemi. So the farther you go, the weirder things get. This actually, happens in Lucian's satire of this whole sort of, ethnographic concern, his true history, where the people end up on the moon, and the customs are even weirder than anything that Herodotus describes because Lucian is trying to satirize people's beliefs and that sort of thing. So he goes as like weird as you can get, really. But that again, it's a
Yeah.
very long-standing idea that the farther you go, the odder things are.
Absolutely. I started in Egypt, but now we're going to get into the Greek and Roman iterations of these fairy and folk tales. Um, I wanted to start out with something that's very familiar to the audience. So I chose Homer's Odyssey.
Mhm,
So the outlines of the tale of Odysseus returning home after 20 years abroad and the siren witch figure of Circe are concepts and motifs that are familiar in folktale, and also to audiences who are interested in Greek myth and the heroic age. So I did take the liberty of creating a couple of
mhm,
slides, or a few slides for our talk here, just to kind of bring this home. But Debbie, let's kind of just talk in general terms about the concept of the homecoming husband, which is one of the motifs in the Odyssey. There are others as well. Of course, Odysseus and his encounter with Polyphemus. is another motif from folktale. But let's talk about this AT974, the homecoming husband, for a bit.
Okay. Yeah, so this is a tale type of, I mean, I have to say that the Odyssey is so extensive that you can actually find not just a lot of folktale motifs, the smaller units, but even, some larger ones because we've got the shipwrecked sailor here too. And people have sometimes questioned whether the Egyptian tale, the shipwrecked sailor, had any influence on the Odyssey. It doesn't seem like there's any sort of really direct literary influence there. Stories of shipwrecks were common in antiquity because seafaring was dangerous, and ultimately, the story of Odysseus can come under the tale type of the homecoming husband because he is spending the entire the entire epic trying to get home, and we see not just his voyages, the most famous part being really books 9 through 12, where he has all his adventures, like with Polyphemus and Circe, but the before and after that, when we hear reports from other people talking about Odysseus, like, "Did you see him in the Trojan War? Where did he go? What happened to him?" And then when he, does get back home to Ithaca, his island kingdom, he has to be very careful. He's been gone for 20 years. He doesn't know what things are like. He's been warned not to just waltz in there and say, "Hi, honey, I'm home," because there could be hostile people, which in fact turns out to be the case. So yeah, the homecoming husband is the overarching story there. And in the end, he does his wife, he convinces his wife that he's really who he says he is. She recognizes him because of a number of things that only the two of them could know and things that only he could do, such as stringing and shooting that bow that's in your slide. But oddly, the homecoming isn't the last thing that happens. The reconciliation between Odysseus and Penelope isn't the last thing that happens. The last thing that happens is that there has to be some sort of sort of a truce between Odysseus and the families of all of the suitors of Penelope that he has killed. So it really ends with okay, everybody stop fighting. The goddess Athena sort of comes down, Deus ex machina like, and says, "Come on, make peace, because otherwise this blood feud is going to go on forever." So it doesn't really quite end with Odysseus and Penelope. It ends with this sort of let's settle the aftermath of the whole homecoming.
Absolutely, and I thought that this was worth reading from
Mhm.
Bill Hansen's Ariadne's thread about the homecoming husband. Um, he just writes in general the story of the man who returns home after a long absence, just as his wife is about to remarry, is known to many peoples, sometimes as a folk tale, often as a legend attached to an allegedly historical character. The story frequently takes the form of a ballad or epic song rather than a prose narrative. And then he goes on to discuss the various motifs that you find in international folktale about this story. Um, and I think it's also worth noting for people who are interested that there is another motif as well, if you're interested, and that is motif. Hold on, let me find it. I apologize, everybody. That is AT1137, the ogre blinded, which is Polyphemus and Odysseus's encounter, which is attested in Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and further afield. So, yes, a lot of these concepts are um, extremely ancient and very interesting. I think it's worth checking out and realizing. And it's hard to say. I think a lot of scholars are divided on when exactly these stories got attached to the figure of Odysseus. But
Mhm.
it's very interesting,
Yeah.
um, these intersections here. Um, and of course, briefly, just because I love Circe, she's our favorite here. Um, let's kind of talk about her as like the siren. Graham Anderson talks about her in his anthology. Um, just let's talk about this concept for a bit.
Sure. I actually like to look at Circe as more of the almost a prototype of But what you see in Hansel and Gretel, one of the Grimm's fairy tales, because what you've got is this witch in her house in the woods, and, maybe more of a palace in Circe's case because she's a demigoddess, but, her house in the woods, and it seems very inviting. Odysseus and his men have landed on this unknown island. They see smoke curling up in the distance, and Odysseus, with his usual not so cautious, decisions, sends some men to investigate to see if it is any place that they can sort of take refuge or maybe find some food. So, initially, this sort of, scouting party goes, to Cersei's place. One of them hangs back and just kind of watches through the window, but the rest of the men are welcomed in by Cersei with her musical voice, and, she's offering them food and drink, and we get this description of how she, mixes a potion with maybe some, mysterious ingredients, and after they drink this and she taps them with her wand, she has a freaking wand, so this is one of the earliest, mentions of a witch-like figure having a wand. She turns them into pigs, and rushes them off to her pigsty, and so the one guy who was watching all this through the window goes back, pretty upset, tells Odysseus what's happened, and Odysseus then has to go and handle the situation. But so I think of Cersei, less as a siren, although she is a siren-like figure in terms of being enticing and drawing men to their doom, but she's also a witch with potions and a wand, changing men, the ability to change men and other beings into other forms. She's actually the one that, at least in some versions of the story, she's the one that transformed Scylla from a beautiful maiden into the hideous monster that Odysseus later encounters. So, yeah, so I think Circe is a wonderfully interesting figure who ends up helping Odysseus and distracting him for about a year too. His men have to say, "Hello, aren't we headed home? We've been here a year. It's nice and all, but we miss our
Absolutely.
families too." So, yeah.
And I do really love that, analogy you made to her as being like kinda like the witch in the woods in Hansel and Gretel, and, I wanted to read this. This is from, Daniel Mendelssohn's wonderful Odyssey translation that just came out
Yeah.
not too long ago, and this is from book 11. And, of course, the guy you're talking about who kinda, like, hangs back and looks through the window or sees everybody getting changed is Eurylochus, right?
Yeah, you're
Eurylochus,
Lucas.
and he's, like, just kinda hanging out, but this is really great because when they kinda come upon, Cersei's, um, kinda palace or whatever in the woods, it really does kinda read like this, like, wicked witch living in the woods. It's like in a wooded glade, they found the dwelling of Circe, built of well-smoothed stones and sited with views on every side. All around it there were lions and mountain-dwelling wolves, which she herself had put under a spell by giving them sinister drugs. Nor did they attack the men. No, indeed. Instead, they stood up on their hind legs and started wagging their long tails. And I'll skip ahead a little bit. So even so, they still feared the dreadful beast. They stood before the door of the goddess, she of the beautiful braids, and heard Circe inside lifting her lovely voice in song, as she wove back and forth at her loom, an immense, immortal thing. The weaving, the weaving a goddess's work, so fine, so delightful, so dazzling. Polites, that captain of men, began to speak his piece, and he's like, "Hey, somebody's weaving inside. Let's go inside, right?" And then she comes and invites them inside, right? And Um, so she's like, "Well, come in." All unaware, they followed her, and then he starts to talk about how, yeah, she starts mixing this like concoction of like cheese and wine and all this stuff, and uses her
Yeah.
wine, puts them in the in the cage. So yeah, it's just wonderful. I love that. I don't know why I didn't draw that analogy, but now it's kind of stuck in my head. So thank you, Debbie.
Well, I'm not
It's
I
really
don't
good.
think it originated with me. I seem to remember reading something somebody somewhere, I think, made the allusion, if not specifically to Hansel and Gretel, then, to the witch in the woods, kind of motif. But yeah, I mean, I think it's, there are obviously a lot of different ways to look at Circe, and not least of which is Madeline Miller's Circe told from Circe's point of view. So,
Awesome. Yeah, yeah, I'll have to look at the scholarship on that 'cause, yeah, I'd like to, look further into that. So let's talk about, so these last 2 examples that I chose, I grouped them together, because they will be very familiar to the audience, not only from folktale motifs, but specifically from the Disney movies. So these are the motifs of
Yeah.
Cinderella and the Sorcerer's Apprentice, um, and Beauty and the Beast, of all things. They're all here.
Mhm.
Few thousand years, a couple of thousand years before we thought they were. So let's
Yeah.
talk about first off the story of Rhodopis, the courtesan, which is the prototype for Cinderella. So Debbie, tell us about this story.
Okay. So this um this story we have two different sources for information about this character Rhodopis. Herodotus, back in the 5th century BCE, doesn't really tell the Cinderella part of the story. He tells us that she was a courtesan and that she, well, first she was a slave, and then she gained her freedom and became a courtesan and was very good at her job and became wealthy. He also says that she probably knew
Not
Aesop.
just
Yeah,
Debbie. Yeah, yeah. I was going to mention. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Debbie. But I was just going to
that's
mention.
right.
Yeah, not just any slave, but a
Right, yeah.
slave with Aesop.
With Aesop, who was also a slave, according to, legend. And so that's what Herodotus tells us about this character. The Cinderella-like part comes from Strabo a bit later. These are both Greek sources, even though the story of Rhodopis is set in Egypt. And so the part that Strabo adds is that, as you can sort of maybe see in the picture in the slide, Rhodopis is bathing one day, in the local pond, and so she, her clothing, her shoes, most of her clothing is lying on the shore. An eagle swoops down, takes one of her shoes, which you can see that in the picture. It's actually a very finely wrought sandal in the story, and the eagle flies it all the way to where the pharaoh is hundreds of miles away. The eagle drops the slipper in the pharaoh's lap, and he is astonished by the intricate workmanship and, rich detail on this sandal, and he's determined to find the owner of the sandal. So he sends messengers throughout the kingdom looking for, the woman whose sandal it was clearly, a woman's sandal. And, he finds Rhodopis and marries her. So, this has a lot of similarities to the Cinderella story. I think, folklorists, non-classics, people who are in folklore who are not classicists, seem kind of reluctant, or at least some of them seem reluctant to say that this has any relation whatsoever to Cinderella. It can't possibly. It's too old and too different. Cinderella's not a prostitute, blah, blah, blah. But I can just give you a handful of similarities that really, from my point of view, make it hard to say that it's not a Cinderella analog. So it is this sort of a story that's called a rise tale, where the status of the protagonist improves from, very low to very high. So Rhodopis starts off as a slave and then a prostitute, a high earning prostitute, but sure, still a prostitute, and she becomes a queen. She has a generic name. Rhodopis means rosy face, and generic names are what you tend to see a lot of in folk tales and fairy tales. Cinderella just means little cinder girl because she was forced by her stepmother to basically sleep in the fireplace and clean the ashes. Though there's the presence of a bird that's actually crucial to the narrative. That's not something you see in the Disney version, other than the bird's like helping her with her chores. But in the Grimm's version, the presence of a bird is like representative of the spirit of her mother. Um, so the bird is kind of important there. And then, of course, there is the shoe, or in this case, a sandal that is unique to the heroine, is the identifying part. There's royalty involved. In this case, it's a king, not a prince, but it's royalty. And there's a search for the owner of the shoe, and the story ends in marriage. I think it's very difficult to say that this is not somehow, analogous, like an early analog. We can't, prove. We don't want to say that this is definitely the story that influenced later Cinderella stories, but we can say it belongs in this tale type, generally. And that it shares some of the very crucial narrative elements that you do see later. There's no step family. There's no forced labor. I mean, like, initially there is. This is the slave part, but I mean, it's. it's very odd that you would I mean, the shoe part alone is like, how can that not be? And then as you, I think noted earlier, Bill Hansen in his Ariadne's thread, discusses this story at length, and he brings in a Chinese counterpart that's nearly as old. And that story, the Chinese version even has at least, what, 2, maybe 3 different versions. But again, it all sort of hinges on the identification of the shoe or a similar item. So, so it's a fun story, but again, it's like, a few sentences long. Like the Strabo is like it's a paragraph. So we're not dealing with literary versions like the Brothers Grimm, which were collected orally, but obviously embellished a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And just getting to the Chinese counterpart, yeah, Bill says in the book, Cinderella is sometimes told as a legend. In fact, it is as a legend that the story is first attested in its entirety in a Chinese work of the 9th century. So, yeah, that's very old. And,
Yeah.
you know, very interesting. See, Venus and Mercury. He talks about, uh, yeah, it's the Chinese legend of Shen Xin. I can't pronounce that. I apologize, everybody. But yeah, it's in both versions. The king is first moved to love. So he's talking about the Rhodopis story and the Chinese
Mhm.
story and the features they have in common. And Bill writes that in both versions, the king is first moved to love by the sight of her shoe rather than by the sight of her,
Mhm.
which is very funny in
What does
retrospect.
this guy have a
Um,
foot fetish? I
Yeah, both narratives are cast as
Yeah.
legends rather than as tales, and both legends were attached to a local tomb that was believed to be the burial place of the heroine or her stepfamily, which is very important in the recounting of I believe Herodotus, right, where he talks about um, I believe when he's talking about Rhodopis, he's talking firstly about the tomb that's attached to her name, how
Yeah.
she came to
Yeah.
pay for it, I believe.
Yeah,
So
I
yeah,
think
that's a
that's
very
right,
interesting
yeah.
parallel.
Yeah, and it's in his
Yeah.
Egyptian section too, the long section where he talks about Egypt. We've been throwing around these different terms like myth, legend, folktale, fairy tale. I think it's important to make sure people understand that there's a lot of overlap. These are not like discrete categories, myth. I mean, when take something like the Odyssey, we usually call that, oh, that's a Greek myth. But is it legend because there's like a semi-historical basis, or is it really just folktale with some fairy tale elements in it? So I think I think it's good not to worry too much about the distinctions among categories like that. I mean, there are definite things like folk tales and fairy tales tend to be set in a world that's more realistic than, say, the world of myth, where it's like focused on the gods and a period of before known history. Whereas folk tales are like, oh, this is the real world, and it may be like once upon a time in a certain kingdom, but it's still like the world as we know it, basically. And there might be gods in these stories, but they take a back seat to the human characters. And myth is more like the opposite of that, I think, in a lot of ways. Like, then they're gods in the Odyssey. They do affect the action, but the focus is very much on Odysseus as a human, relatable character.
And Debbie, I'm glad you brought up those distinctions. For the purposes of what we're discussing here today, yeah, it's important to understand that there's a lot of overlap and we're talking more in general terms. But it reminded me of actually a very affordable and a wonderful book that, again, by Bill Hansen. We're talking about a lot of pricey books today. I apologize. But a book that's very affordable and very wonderful that I love to just kind of have around to like crack open because it's very, it's an anthology type book, but it's a book called The Book of Greek and Roman
Hmm.
folk tales, legends, and myths.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
Bill has a really good introduction to differentiate. He's really good at categorizing these different tales, and it gets a lot more complex. There's catch tales, there's
Hmm.
heroic credence tales, things like that. So it gets more complicated. But for the purposes of our discussion today, we're being very general, and
Hmm.
it's just best for the audience to keep in mind that, yeah, like Debbie said, there's a lot of overlap with these categories.
Yeah, yeah, and I've actually got that book of bills also, and so it's definitely possible to go into a lot more detail about the distinctions But I think, yeah, for what we're talking about today, there's just sort of some fluidity across the stories and various elements, whether it's a tale type or motifs and all that. Yeah. Mm.
Absolutely. And I want to get into probably my favorite of all of these tales today. But we're going to talk next about um, the lover of lies, the Philopseudes, the story of Pancrates and Eucrates that Lucian of Samosata tells in Philopseudes 35 through 36. Um, this is AT 325, Apprentice and Ghost. So, Debbie, tell us about this story.
Sure, I love this story. I think that the version in Lucian, more particularly this story, may be better known to audiences as the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Does that sound, have you heard it called that also, or?
Yes, yes, of
Yeah,
course.
because it's at least in the Lucian story, the Pancrates story, it's not so much a ghost as an inanimate object being animated. Excuse me. Sorry, I need a sip of water here. Um, if the Pancrates story, if I understand the one that you're referring to, it's Pancrates is an Egyptian. We've got a lot of Egypt running through this discussion. So Lucian is a second century CE author, but the stories are set that he tells in the Philopseudes, the lover of lies. The stories come from all over. So Pancrates is an Egyptian magician, a wise man who can swim with the crocodiles, which impresses everybody. The crocodiles don't try to eat him. He swims with them. He has magical ability over animals,
Yeah,
like
that was
Circe.
my favorite part.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
The crowd he's, like, swimming with them, and they're, like, being, like,
wagging their
really nice and
tails.
lovey
They're
with him. Yeah,
wagging their tails in the
yeah,
story
that's
there. You're like,
awesome.
I think so. But and so then there's this Greek character who was on a voyage to Egypt who wants, I think it's oh shoot, who was it? Was it Eucrates? I'm actually forgetting.
Yeah, it's Eucrates. So
It
so
is Eucrates. Okay.
the story is in of the lover of lies is
Yeah.
this, it takes place in the
Yeah.
house of this guy named Eucrates, and he's an old man now, but the tale he's recounting is when he
From when
was
he was
younger and
young.
he was in
Yeah.
Egypt, and he finds this Theos Anner, this holy man, Pancrates,
Yeah.
who is loosely based on a historical character, or historical person, at least a kind of an assemblage of stories, but that's another tale. I have a talk with Daniel Ogden coming out about that one.
Oh, I
Um,
bet.
but
Yeah.
um, but
Yeah, and
yeah,
so I remember the story. I just couldn't remember which character was from the dialogue was so because Eucrates also tells that story about his dead wife coming back, right? Yeah.
right, yeah, that's the
Yeah.
story that's where yeah, it talks about the shoe and the dog and
It's
everything.
yeah, another
Um,
shoe is involved. Losing a shoe is a thing in antiquity. There's like mono-sandalism is actually a thing in anyway. But yeah, so Eucrates apprentices himself to Pancrates, like, and he's basically just like the gopher, right? Like he's the servant boy for Pancrates, and he says that Pancrates was very generous with all of his spells, and he was teaching me stuff, but the spell I really wanted to know the most is the one he wouldn't tell me, and this was that when they were traveling, Pancrates said, we don't need to bring any servants with us because we'll have, I'll handle that. And so what Pancrates did everywhere they went was he would say this spell. Apparently it was like, what was it, 3 syllables or yeah, I think it was just 3 syllables or something. And he would animate like a pestle or the beam of a door or a broom, and that inanimate object would become animate, and it would be their household servant wherever they went, and it would do the marketing and fetch the water and this and that. So Eucrates really wants to know this spell, but Pancrates doesn't want to share that one. Eucrates overhears it one day and enacts it, and he has I think it's actually like a door bolt, but we're just gonna call it a broom because people are probably more familiar with that version from Disney's The Sorcerer's Apprentice episode of
yeah,
Fantasia.
it's a
Yeah,
pest. He animates a pestle or like
yeah,
the doorpost, but
the door bar,
a
yeah.
broom is one of the things that could be
That
animated by
he
this
it is
spell.
mentioned in there, yeah. So Eucrates animates this inanimate object And, it dresses it like it dresses it like a person so it can go out and sort of be disguised and do the marketing. And he tells it to fetch the water because Eucrates is tired of all this manual labor, doesn't wanna do it. So the thing goes and it fetches water, and, then Eucrates wants it to stop and realizes he didn't quite catch the end of the spell, like how to stop it. And so this animated, piece of wood keeps drawing water until the whole house is flooded. And, basically, Pancrates comes back, stops, says the spell that ends it, is furious, and just leaves. He's done with Eucrates he's like, "Forget about it, no more apprenticeship." So and Eucrates, in the context of the dialogue, because again, this is like he's telling a story. He's old now, he's telling a story from when he was younger. So the people around him are saying, "So do you still know the spell, and can you, like, show us?" And Eucrates says, "Well, yeah, I still remember how to start it, but I shouldn't do it because I still don't know how to stop it. So I don't know how to turn it off." So, yeah,
Yeah, that's
it's a really fun story.
hilarious.
And that
And
is
it's
the
really
earliest, yeah. I was just gonna say it's
oh, sorry, no.
the earliest known version, I think, of the, Sorcerer's Apprentice story. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what's really interesting about this story is that it's tied into a story we talked about briefly last time, and that everybody who watches this show knows that I'm a big fan of, which is the story of Arignatus in the haunted house. So it turns out in the course of the story that Arignatus and Eucrates both shared Pancrates as
Mhm.
a master or a teacher at one point.
Yeah.
Uh,
Mm,
so it's very interesting. And Daniel Ogden points out in his wonderful commentary and
yeah.
translation of The Lover of Lies, which is called In Search of the Sorcerer's
Mhm.
Apprentice.
Yep,
He
I've got
points
that one
out
too.
that yeah, it's a wonderful book, and he points out that, and, one thing that he pointed out was that, these books that, Arignatus has to expel the demon or the
Are
daimon, the
Egyptian!
ghost in the haunted
Yeah.
house, are the Egyptian books that he got from Pancrates. So it's a very, very fun, and then he
Yeah.
also draws attention to the concept of the in the Greek and Egyptian magical formularies, the PGM of the Piedros, the assistant, the inanimate object that turns into a daimonic assistant.
Mm.
And he gives several selections of these spells to create an assistant to do to fetch
Yeah. It's a
fetch things like you know uh whatever you need to do whatever you want. I think it's like the first spell in Hans Dieter Betz translation of these texts. So it's very interesting, these concepts and motifs in popular culture that were going on
yeah.
at the time.
I mean, was it like a Hyperborean magician who animated a little thing and sent it away to it was part of an erotic spell, I think, or something, like send a message to someone's lover or so I can't quite remember, but there are these spells in the Greek magical papyri that suggest people believed you could really do this sort of thing.
Yeah, creating and I think that actually happens in that happens in The Lover of Lies as well. There's a section
Mhm.
where
Yeah,
um they hire a Hyperborean mage, one of
that
the
was the one I
because
was
there's
thinking
all
of,
these different
yeah.
characters, these different
Yeah.
philosophers telling different stories.
Uh-huh.
And of course Lucian is making fun of their respective viewpoints. And one of them tells a story about how he hired this I believe it's the Hyperborean mage to create an assistant to go fetch
Mhm.
um this girl that he was in love with.
Yeah, that's the
And
story I
it's
was
it's a
thinking
longer
of,
story, but
yeah.
yeah, it's a great story. And of course you have the story and a related, well, not related, but like another ancient narrative in Apuleius's Metamorphoses or the Golden Ass, where
Mm.
um, the witch Pamphile um, animates the wineskins, and Lucius, when he's drunk coming home, kills the or stabs the wineskins, and he think he's killed these robbers. So
Yeah.
very interesting motifs. But yeah, like the Sorcerer's Apprentice is extremely interesting and influential story. We don't get it directly from Lucian to Disney. Of course, it goes through
Yeah.
Goethe first, and
Yes.
then plays and things like that before it gets to Mickey Mouse. But
Yes.
you know, and eventually, I think they made a movie with Nicolas Cage too. I can't
They
remember,
did!
but
That's right. Was
yeah,
it yeah. Yeah,
that was
I
a long
you're
time
right.
ago.
I yeah, I think I saw it a while back, but it's been a while. I don't quite remember the details, but yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so Debbie, let's get to the kind of the tour de force of these fairy tales today. Um,
Sure.
it's hard to kind of top that one, but we're going to get into the most fairy tale of fairy tale stories in antiquity, and of course, I'm talking about Cupid and Psyche, which is in book. Speaking of Apuleius, books 4 through 6 of the Golden Ass. So tell us about this tale, Debbie. Um, this conforms to AT 425, The Search for the Lost Husband, which is, and I want everybody to realize this, this is pretty much Beauty and the Beast, as will
Yeah, this
become,
is,
you know,
I think this is the earliest version of an analog for Beauty and the Beast, tale type, yeah. I think, yeah, there's this, it's almost exactly in the middle of his metamorphoses too, and there's a larger context. An old woman is telling this story to a young girl who's been kidnapped by robbers, trying to, distract her, keep her calm. But it's a very self-contained story, and it literally starts off with, there was in a certain kingdom, or sorry, there were in a certain kingdom, a king and queen. know? So it's the closest thing to a once upon a time, really. Although I think some of the Greek stories also start with like an indefinite like pota, at one time. Anyway, so this the introduction is basically there's a kingdom, there's a king and queen. They have three daughters. The youngest daughter is the most beautiful. In fact, she's so beautiful that the goddess Venus gets jealous of her. Envious of her, and is kind of Venus is furious because people in the kingdom are worshiping the beauty of this youngest daughter instead of worshiping Venus, and like Venus's altars are left neglected and cold, and cold ashes and all that. Anyway, so the Venus has her son Cupid. She commands her son to make Psyche fall in love with the worst possible man in the entire world, as a punishment. Like she's so beautiful, let her marry the ugliest, most wretched, most poverty-stricken guy ever. So Cupid is supposed to go and do this. I guess I should preface this by saying, and I'll try not to go on too long too. We call the story Cupid and Psyche now, but for the ancient audience, they don't find out until halfway through the story of that the husband is in fact Cupid because it's mysterious. It's meant to be mysterious. So calling it Cupid and Psyche has kind of ruined it for posterity. But anyway, so Cupid, as far as we know, Cupid's going off and doing what his mom tells him to do. And so the next thing we know, there's this prophecy that the youngest daughter, whose name is Psyche, uh, is going to be her fate is to meet a horrible monster, and so they leave her up on a cliff. It's this very sort of funereal procession while she's being led to her wedding with this monstrous being, whose characteristics happen to be very similar to Cupid. Uh, anyway, so it turns out that instead of, being devoured by some monster, which is what everybody thought was going to happen, they've left her up on this cliff, and the west wind wafts her gently down to a valley with this palace with invisible servants, and basically a mysterious husband who comes and makes her his wife, which is kind of a euphemism for, basically this strange man comes into her bedroom and has sex with her. So I don't know how much of this you want in the chat
No,
in our
we're
discussion.
not gonna sugarcoat it. In my talk
Yeah.
with Joel Relian, we just said
Mm.
that yeah, he basically, I don't know, I can't remember the exact words, but Apuleius says that, it became easier for her with time as he came to her
Mhm.
bedroom every night. So in
Yeah.
a sense, he rapes her.
He does. That very
Um,
first night,
yeah, yeah.
she's freaking terrified. And I think Apuleius says almost literally in the Latin, the unseen, husband came or man came into the bedroom, which was darkened, and made her his wife. So he forced himself on her. But I part of what's going on there, not that this mitigates it at all, but there's a lot of reflection in there of, how, what Roman marriage would have been like, because the girls would have been 11, 12, 13. I mean, basically, as soon as they start menstruating and therefore can have children, they aren't married off, and they don't necessarily have a say in who they're married to, right? It's all like, a lot of it was arranged by families. So there are some aspects of the story, particularly that so-called wedding night, that are pretty terrifying. But yeah, then Apuleius says, well, this kept happening every night, and she didn't see the husband because he would just come in at night in the dark, and he would say to her, "Don't try to see me. That's going to cause some serious problems. I need to know that I can trust you." And she's okay with that status quo for a really long time. She gets pregnant, and she's happy that she's gonna have a child, and meanwhile, she's being waited on by invisible servants, and she gets accustomed to, living that life. But she does get lonely, and she, sort of, she says to her, unseen husband, she can feel him, right? He's got soft cheeks, he's got hair, flowing hair, this and that. She can't see him, but she can feel him. She says, "It's been a while. My family think I'm dead. I'd really like to see my sisters." And, this is where things start to go very wrong. The unseen husband, who has still not been named in the actual Latin in the story, he says, "Well, I do feel bad for you. I understand, but you can have them visit, but don't listen to anything they say. Don't let them try to convince you to see me. Don't break the rules, basically." So the sisters get to come visit the same, soft breeze, the west wind, the zephyr that brought Psyche down also brings the sisters down. And when they see this amazing palace that their younger sister is living in, and, they see all the magical things happening there and all the jewels and this and that, they are so envious. They were married off to princes, but again, married off is kind of the key there. It's not like they had a lot of say. And they're pretty envious. One of them says, "Oh God, my husband is like old and balding." And the other one says, "Mine's arthritic and I have to rub this stinky lotion on him." So even though they've been, settled well according to ancient standards, they clearly don't have the sort of mystery and romance and in their lives that Psyche now seems to have. So they're like, "Well, what's your husband like?" And she is. You got to remember, Psyche is very young and she's naive and she can't keep track of what she's saying. She keeps giving him different stories. "Oh, he does this. Oh, no, but wait, he does that too." And they get suspicious that she has no clue who her husband is. They come back for a second visit and they say, we're really concerned about you. We think that your husband is not showing himself to you because he is in reality a giant monstrous serpent who just wants to eat you and your unborn child. And that's why he's fattening you up with all, the invisible servants giving you all these meals and all that." So they convince her to take a knife and cut off his head. So again, it's a very long, elaborate story, and even if it had some origins in oral tradition, it's being very told in a very leisurely and in a very literary style, lots of descriptive details. So, despite the fact that Psyche has been able to feel her husband, she is convinced by her sisters that he's some sort of a monstrous serpent who sneaks out and eats the neighbors, and their livestock along the river. And so she takes a knife, sort of hides it in her clothing, takes a lamp, goes into her husband's bedroom, like with the knife in one hand and a lamp in the other, and sees her husband for the first time. And she's like, "What the?" Basically, because she recognizes that, he's this beautiful god Cupid because he's got wings. Somehow those never came up in the previous descriptions of her feeling him. He's got wings, he's got his quiver with his arrows, and she's already basically enamored of the sight of him, but she's picking up his quiver with his arrows and looking at them, she accidentally pricks her finger on one of them, and that has the extra effect. And there's a very famous line in Apuleius that upon, pricking her finger on one of his arrows, she fell in love with love. And then, unfortunately, she drops a bit of the oil from the lamp on his shoulder. He wakes up, he's furious, and he abandons her, basically. Long story short, he leaves. That's where you get the search for the lost husband. So, like, the entire rest of the story, except for a little, sort of epilogue, is Psyche, pregnant, by the way, going on this very long, arduous quest to find her lost husband, who she now knows is Cupid. And she despairs a lot of the time, kind of like Odysseus in some ways, when he gets a little, despairing, like, "What do you mean go to the underworld? I don't have to go to the underworld." And Psyche goes through something even more serious in some ways, because again, she's pregnant. She doesn't have anybody, a crew with, not that Odysseus's crew was so helpful, but but she does have, various aspects of nature helping her along the way. So, for example, when she finally gets to Venus's palace where Cupid has retreated, Venus says, "Yeah, you can't see him until you perform all these tasks for me." So, one of the tasks, for example, is to have to sort this pile of mixed grains before the end of the day. And that may sound familiar from some of the Grimm's fairy tales where similar things happen. The protagonist is assigned, the seemingly impossible tasks. This is sort of like in Jason and the Argonauts when he's got to somehow yoke these bronze footed fire breathing bulls and sow some seeds in a field and can't do it without help from Medea. Well, Psyche gets help from a troop of ants. Psyche is so nice and gentle and young and naive that all these aspects, all these creatures kind of want to help her. So these ants help her sort the grain. Venus comes in at the end of the day and she's like, "Yeah, no way did you do that yourself, but it did get done, and I forgot to say you shouldn't have any helpers," whatever. Anyway, so there are several more tasks that Psyche is able to get through thanks to help from people. But the very last task, maybe no surprise there, is that she has to go to the underworld. And in this case, because it's, sort of a female oriented story and tension between mother in law and daughter in law, that again reflects a lot of what's actually going on in society. The
Yeah,
task is
Venus Venus in this story is essentially the wicked stepmother.
she's like the shrewish a mother-in-law, I would say, even more than. But yeah, exactly. Sort of almost like the stepmother in later stories, and definitely sort of the stereotypical mother-in-law who, is upset that she has a daughter-in-law that she didn't want, because Psyche's immortal, and Cupid shouldn't have. Cupid was supposed to make Psyche fall in love with some mortal wretch and not fall in love with her himself, which is what happened. Anyway, so the task is to fetch a box of Persephone's or Proserpina's beauty from the underworld. And so Psyche doesn't have to go fetch Cerberus like Heracles did, or go and talk to the ghosts of the underworld the way Odysseus did. She has to basically fetch some cosmetics from the underworld, or allegedly fetch what are allegedly cosmetics. So she gets advice on her way, like, here, have some barley cakes to give Cerberus so that you can get past him, and this and that. So Proserpina gives her. She says it's Psyche says it's for Venus. Proserpina's like, "Oh, sure, here's the box." And of course, as Psyche, with a female's curiosity and vanity, thinks, "Oh, well, I need some of this, like, beauty, magical beauty stuff myself, because I've been on this really long quest and I'm sort of wrecked." And she opens the box and it turns out to be the sleep of death, which, I don't know if Venus and Proserpina had somehow arranged this, but whatever. So in fact, despite having gone through all this arduous quest, succeeded on tasks, she fails at this last one. She falls into the deathly sleep. And here it's kind of like Sleeping Beauty. Cupid has to, finally stand up for himself, tell his mom off, and go find Psyche. So he wakes her up, and then he goes to Jupiter, king of the gods, for some arbitration and mediation. And Jupiter says, "Let's see if we can arrange things so that all parties will be happy." And he says to Venus, "How about if we make Psyche an immortal?" And she's like, "Oh, I guess that would be fine." So it ends with this wonderful wedding ceremony and feast. And the very last thing that happens is that Psyche gives birth to the child, whose name is Pleasure, voluptas in Latin. Yeah, so that's it.
Absolutely.
Very, very long literary story there. But again, one of the reasons we saved this one for last is because it is so detailed. So long enough to really, like, sort of fit in with the, French fairy tales, the Grimm's fairy tales, in terms of its intricacy.
Right, and for those in the audience who are familiar or who are interested in this motif, this other motif of the tasks that Venus is assigning to Psyche, that is AT425B, the disenchanted husband, the witch's tasks, which is the heroine enters into the service of a witch who assigns her apparently impossible tasks, and again that is from William Hansen's Ariadne's Thread. Again, an invaluable resource if you're interested in the intersection of classics and folklores. But yeah, Debbie, like you said, this is such an intricate story. And I think that the reason why I wanted to end on it and why I think it's such a great example of fairy tales in antiquity or folk tales in antiquity is that not only is it, like Bill said, the most fairy tale of fairy
Oh, you've sort of
tale
cut
stories,
out.
it's
Can you
that oh, sorry, did I
you cut out on my end a little bit. I don't know if, you've probably got the recording, but you cut out on my end, so I can't quite hear. Sorry.
oh, okay. Oh,
Yeah, and it's out of
sorry.
sync and, a little bit.
Yeah, let me start that over.
Okay. Mm.
Let me start that over then. I apologize, and I'll fix that.
Oh, no worries.
But I believe Cupid and Psyche is a great example of the cross-cultural fluidity of these narratives in general.
Mhm.
There's a lot of things going on in it. Not only is the sense of the Greek and Latin connections of the story, but it has also been argued that several Apuleian scholars that they're indigenous Berber folktale traditions from North Africa, as Apuleius is from North Africa. But there's also a lot of things that Apuleius is doing with this seemingly simple story of a girl's coming of age within
Yes.
the context of the book. The book itself, Psyche's story mirrors the journey of Lucius himself through her curiositas, and how that gets her into trouble, just like it gets Lucius
Yeah.
into trouble. But
Yeah.
there's also another aspect of it where Apuleius is writing a Roman novel for a North African and a Latin audience, but he's also incorporating the story that, aside from all the fantastic elements, would not be out of place in a text by somebody like Xenophon or Cariton. It's still a story of a boy and a girl who are in love, who
Yes.
have to are separated, and then they have to find some way to come back together.
Yeah.
And of course, you have
Mm.
several 19th and 20th century psychoanalytical and
Mhm.
psychological interpretation of
Yeah.
the story, which I don't
Yeah.
personally subscribe to, but
Yeah.
it was very important
Mm.
for that Jungian kind of interpretation of things. So, like I said,
Yeah.
this is a great tale and a great example of cross-cultural fluidity.
Yeah, and, I mean, what you were just saying, the name Psyche, I mean, that actually means soul or spirit in Greek, and so the whole, psychological interpretation that you're talking about, um, I mean, the 19th and 20th century psychologists really did sort of get into it a little too much, saying, "Oh, Psyche is clearly the spirit, and Cupid is clearly the flesh, and soul and body have to work together." But, Psyche as representing the spirit and its, arduous quest and is I mean, like you say, there are different ways to interpret it, but I think one thing that's worth noting is that even pretty early on, Psyche in art was represented with wings and, sort of butterfly wings, and so even before 19th to 20th century psychology, there was this tradition of thinking of Psyche, at least, as kind of representing the soul or spirit, being a bit allegorical there. Butterflies and moths also representing, the solar spirit, and that's we've seen that in a bunch of movies too, like, Silence of the Lambs, for example. There's something more recent, the one with Hugh Grant and the Mormon girls, what was that called? Heretic, I think. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, see what I'm talking about. So the use of these sort of butterfly-like figures, as representing the solar spirit, I think, in some ways does trace back to the concept of psyche, and not necessarily the Cupid psyche, but the Homeric psyche, which was, in the Iliad, the soul like flew out, and departed from its body. So there's, I mean, there definitely you can see where the allegorical interpretations could come from, but I tend to agree with you. I think. some people went a little too far with that. And then of course there's, the Beauty and the Beast angle, which is, the husband who seems monstrous is not. He's the opposite. So although I mean, his treatment of Psyche in some respects might seem monstrous to a modern audience, but like you say, her quest really is representing, or her whole story is like these rites of passage, leaving home, getting married, with no say in it, having the kid eventually, the more formal marriage at the end is a little different. And so
Mhm.
she's going into a different stage of her life at that point, having the kid, really, becoming a mother, fulfilling all her responsibilities is like a good Roman. Even though I should say, with the Once Upon a Time in a Certain Kingdom, we don't even know where this is set. It doesn't say Italy, and there's an Oracle of Apollo over in Asia that they consult, not Delphi. And so there are definitely some Asiatic elements in there, along with, as you say, these recent studies that are pointing to maybe some North African elements in the story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And anybody who wants to learn more about the North African elements of native Berber traditions in that text can refer to a wonderful volume edited by Benjamin Todd Lee called Apuleius in Africa, which is a bunch of wonderful essays about Apuleius's North African connections and his connection to his African audiences through his epidatic speeches and these stories. Um, But actually, Debbie, you were talking about how, uh, actually, before I get into this, the a good analogy to this story as a coming of age for a woman is actually the Homeric hymn to Demeter.
Hmm.
There's a similar story there where, Demeter's daughter is taken by Hades, who's her uncle, just out of the blue, you know, and basically taken to
Yeah.
this lavish underworld palace and, she's given everything, but it's still weird. It's like, when you
Yeah.
read the Cupid and Psyche story, it's like she has all these invisible servants doing everything
Hmm.
for her, but think about how terrifying that would be for like
Hmm.
a young girl. Like she's just in this
Yeah.
place and she doesn't see
Exactly.
anybody, things are just happening. It's very weird.
Well, yeah, and I mean that whole scene in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, it's basically the rape of Persephone. She's with her fellow maidens picking flowers, symbolically, picking flowers in a meadow, when suddenly this chasm opens up. Hades comes out with his chariot and just grabs her, takes her down. And, then Demeter goes on a quest for the lost daughter. And, yeah, so Persephone goes through these, it's some of these stories are very harsh reflections of, or maybe I should say reflections of how harsh things were for, girls growing, in the stages of life that they were expected to go through in a
Mhm.
patriarchal society.
Absolutely. And my take on Cupid is actually a bit different because I think that it's really interesting that she's taken up to the rock, kind of like Andromeda. And my conception of Cupid or Eros in these texts, not only in this text itself, this Latin novel, but also in the Greek novels, like for instance something like the Ephesiaca of Xenophon, is that Cupid is almost like this terrifying force that even the gods
Yes.
are afraid of.
Yes, and
You
that's what that
look at
prophecy
his
says in the Apuleius. Yeah.
he really is like the serpent, like, he's somebody that,
Mhm,
like, even Jupiter or Zeus fears.
mhm,
You look at how he's portrayed in Hesiod, and, the first things in, existence that make everything go round is, love and strife and Empedocles, right? So, it's the same kinda concept. I would argue that, and especially how he's portrayed in something like Xenophon of Ephesus, Cupid is Eros is very changeable and
mhm.
very, very, like, prone to, these outbursts of, anger. So I would argue that he kind of is a serpent in a way, but that's a story for another talk.
Yeah.
But
Well,
yeah,
yeah,
no,
but I
yeah,
think.
wonderful.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was gonna add that at least in the Apuleius, in some ways, he also has to grow up and mature, because he is, foreshadowed as this monstrous creature that, Jupiter is afraid of, and he's, fickle, irresponsible, terrifying in his own way. But when we finally meet him, especially in regards to his relationship. I mean, well, not when we meet him early, we just don't know that he's a husband necessarily, aside from the title of the story. But his relationship with his mother, or rather, her relationship with him, is very disturbing in a lot of ways. She does infantilize him, but she also gives him this big open mouth kiss at one point. And when he is wounded by the hot oil, he flies home to mommy and he pouts in his room and complains about how much pain he's in. And he stays in his room and pouts. He's like a freaking teenager. And so, it isn't, and towards the end of the story, he finally has to start standing up for himself and standing up to his mother and kind of individuating, right? He has to kind of separate from his mother, get his wife, make it clear that he wants to move on to this stage of his life. So it's not just Psyche who has to go through these kind of rites of passage as she grows up, but Cupid in the story actually matures quite a bit as well in some realistic ways. We see less of him as this creature who can cause people to fall in love or hate, and even the gods, and more of him as the son and husband figure, which is kind of an interesting characterization. And then, of course, Venus is a shrewish mother-in-law. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see his, his progression through the story. He starts out as, like, this, yeah, like you said, this infantilized, you know, son with this doting mother, almost like a, um, Norman Bates and his mom in a strange, funny way. Um, and he kind of progresses into
Yeah.
the prototypical hero of the Greek novel, who's like this young man who has to, kind of grow up. So very interesting. Debbie, I know we've covered a lot of ground, and I want to give you this time to kind of emphasize anything you feel we missed, plug anything you have going on. Feel free to use this time.
Oh, thank you. I think I managed to bring in, you gave me time already to sort of bring in things about the individual stories and some of the themes that weren't necessarily at the forefront of all of this. But yeah, I think there's still a lot of work that people can do on fairy tales in the ancient world, and it's really been fun to try to. I taught a class on the topic for the first time this last spring, and it was one of the questions I liked to ask the students was, what was the most interesting or surprising thing you learned this semester, as opposed to asking them what they hated about the semester, right? So anyway, what's the most interesting or surprising thing? And, the almost across the board, the typical answer is, "I didn't realize that there were ancient versions of so many of these stories." And we did talk about them as, ancient analogs, as opposed to definite versions that influence later ones. That the idea being, as Bill Hansen points out in Ariadne's thread, that we've got these variants, we've got these analogs, like analogous tales, and we call them that because we can't say that they definitely influenced later versions, but they're out there. Maybe people heard them. A lot of the, when, the French and German fairy tale collections were being put together by people like the Brothers Grimm and others, those people tended to have educations that were grounded in classics, like learning Greek and Latin was kind of typical for a long time. So maybe they did have some exposure to some of these stories, but we just can't say for sure which early versions influence later ones. And it is, I think, also important to remember that for a lot of the ancient stories, there is definitely an oral tradition or oral transmission aspect to them. I mean, one of the things you said about the Odyssey, for example, was who knows when some of these elements were put in the story, like the Polyphemus episode, which, is, a very nice kind of almost separate episode in and of itself. So the oral influence on a lot of the ancient stories is very evident. But I mean, that said, the Brothers Grimm were collecting fairy tales. They were listening to people tell stories from their own country, and the Grimm's brothers were writing them down. So these were also originally orally told stories. Some of the French stories, especially the earliest French version of Beauty and the Beast, are very elaborate, more literary type stories, like with a lot of elaboration along the lines of Apuleius, actually. And so it's The story that Apuleius tells is very literarily elaborate, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, but that doesn't mean it couldn't have come from various oral stories. Ultimately, he may put
Absolutely.
his own, writing, in his own details. And there is a sort of a disjunction between the context of the story in Apuleius' Metamorphosis, which is this old woman's telling it to this young girl. Is this old woman really gonna be this literary, in her telling? So, but, yeah,
One of
it's
the
the
many
sort of question
problems
that
of
it really is.
Apuleius.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a whole other issue there with that story in terms of what it foreshadows about the young girl that it's being told to. But that's another
Yeah.
discussion. You can see my talk with Jill Rolohan about that one. Um, but
Yeah.
Debbie, it's always wonderful to get to talk to you about all these interesting and crazy stories from antiquity, whether it be ghosts or monsters or in this case fairy tales. I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and sharing your knowledge with the audience and with me. It's very much appreciated.
Well, thanks again for having me, and, you clearly know so much about all of these, stories yourself. I mean, somebody should interview you, you know, but yeah,
I'm
it's
just the dumb guy who talks to the smart people. So you're bound to pick something up, bound to pick something up eventually if you pay attention. So I appreciate you being a part of this. So thank you so much, Debbie.